Hey guys, this PowerPoint is the craft PowerPoint. Hope everybody's still doing all right. So let's go ahead and get started. Um, craft is basically an activity involving skill in making things by hand, normally used for functional purposes, meaning that the main concept, the main idea is that when you're creating an object, and this object is it's guided to have functionality. It is considered craft, not art. So for example, if you're making an object because it's going to be, I don't know, a flower pot, or it's going to be a cup, or it's going to be an ashtray, or it's going to be something that's going to be decorative in your house, all of those things are functional. So because they have a functionality, they are not art, they are craft. So that is the big difference between art and craft. Um, if you go into a store and you see paintings, right? The paintings were made by hand, but these paintings that are made specifically to be of an interior design purpose, right? To just plainly decorate a space. Those paintings, even though they're paintings, they're considered craft, not art. Now, what is the difference with art? Well, so far we've learned, hopefully through the semester, that art is it's something that has an idea. It has an undercurrent of an idea, and the materials change sometimes, right? And sometimes they don't change. So, but the main thing, and what I want to stress, is that art has an idea, and that idea evolves, changes, etc., etc. While craft is not so much. Craft, even though it's made by hand, it has a functional purpose, and a lot of times also a what you call it, monetary outcome, meaning it's made with an idea of being sold or marketed in some ways. So that's something that I want to make sure they're clear. Now, there's objects that are even further, oops, before I continue on. So craft, for example, you have objects that are made of ceramics, glass, metal, wood, fibers, things of that nature. And I'll go back in a minute and talk about why clay and ceramics are side by side like that. We'll clarify that in a minute. Anyways, so what I was going to say a minute ago is that even though we do have objects that are made functionally, there's even a further down type of object made by hand, and that's kitsch. So kitsch is an object that is made to look functional, but at the very end it's actually just completely decorative. So think about, a salt and pepper shaker made to look like a cat, and some of us have this kind of things at home, objects that, look purposeful or functional, and at the end they don't work. So, like the salt and pepper shaker, you put salt and pepper in it, after 2 shakes they're clogged, right? So they really don't work for the purpose they were supposed to be made for. So that's kitsch. And through this PowerPoint, we're gonna see the difference between craft and kitsch, but also how craft and kitsch themselves, as way of creating objects, can be elevated to an artistic point. Okay, so keep all those things in mind. All right, let's talk about the very first one. This is clay and ceramics. So why do and throughout the semester, I've been talking about clay and ceramics separately, or not separately, but when I say clay, I normally also follow up with saying ceramics and vice versa. Well, there's a main reason for it. Clay itself, it's the combination of soil or silica with water. It's just the mud stuff. Now, you add volcanic ash and other elements so that when you put it in the kiln, it hardens, right? It becomes harder, and it becomes less porous. However, the clay is just that gooey stuff that's malleable. Sorry, guys, malleable, that you can play with, and so forth and so on. Now, once you take that clay and you let it dry, and then you put it in the kiln, once it goes in the kiln and it solidifies through fire, through heat, it is no longer clay. Now it's called ceramics. So that is the difference between clay and ceramics. Clay is an object that is made with the mud, and then you let it dry, and that's it. And there's some objects in the art world that are made out of clay. Now, if you take that clay and you put it in the kiln, then you no longer have clay. Now you have a ceramic. Now you're thinking, wow, that's kind of weird. Well, I don't think so. I think most of you have gone made bread or made a cake, right? So you start with dough, right? You mix the dough and whatever else, and then you put it in the oven. Then when it comes out, you no longer have dough. You have bread. Same thing with the cake. You mix all the ingredients of cake, and you have that cake batter. But then when you pull it out, you no longer have cake batter, or you don't call it cake batter. You call it a cake. So same thing with clay and ceramics. Clay goes in, ceramics comes out. Now, a person who works with ceramics, a person who works with clay, is normally called a ceramicist, or a ceramicist, or a ceramic sculptor. Now, there are some ceramicists that focus specifically in creating pots, objects that can hold, liquids or objects and so forth and so on, vessels of sorts. Now, plates and things like that as well. And those individuals are the label for them is potter. However, most of them like to be called potters. Most of them like to be called ceramicists. Even though that's a correct name, they just don't like it. But those are individuals who specialize in making dishes. Alright, so when we're looking at clay and working with clay and ceramics, there's two ways of creating objects. The first one is hand building. So hand building you can do in a couple different ways. The first way is the coil method. And the coil method is basically you have this, you create this long thin objects, or you can strew them from a machine that will pull this little perfect coils out of clay, and then you build them one on top of the other on top of the other. Basically an old-fashioned 3D printing. Once you have them all layered up, then you change the surface to whatever surface you want, whatever texture you want, and you can add to it. The other way you can do it is through slab building. And slab building is when you take the clay and you layer it on a table and you flatten it out to about a quarter of an inch, right? Kind of like this. And then you cut it into pieces and then you glue them together. Now the way you glue them together, if you notice here what this person is doing right here, they're actually adding more clay, but this clay is a little bit more wet. So you scratch the surface first, you scratch the edge so you want to put, or you want to glue, quote unquote, and then you add the same clay, just wetter, in the edge, and then you attach those two objects together, or these pieces together, and they actually become solidified eventually. So that's how you create a slab built piece of object made out of clay. Now the other way that you can do it is through throwing. And throwing is just when you shape clay on a wheel. You guys have probably seen this on TV and in memes and things of that nature. And basically you put the clay in the center of the wheel, and then as the wheel spins, then you slowly pull the clay out into space, and then you can create an object. And this is what I'm talking about. Now, I don't think I'm able to play the video for you guys right now, but I'm going to try to see if I can upload it so you guys can see the video, at least the link right here, the link that shows rather that YouTube link. So you guys can check it out and see how throwing works. If you've seen the movie Ghost, that makes it look like it's very, very simple. However, I've done this many times. This is not all my work, but this is what vessels look like after they're thrown. But as you guys can see here, I've done this quite a bit, and it's not an easy process. It takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of practice, knowing exactly where to put your hands, where to put your elbows, and so forth and so on. Some people are more natural at it, but it does take many hours to perfect and to understand how to work with the clay. Now, another thing is that not all the clays are the same. You think of clay and then, this kind of monolithic idea of this mud-like substance comes to mind. And you have to understand that clay is not all the same. Depending on the mixture of it, different things come out. I would like to think of like flour, right? So with flour you can make cake, and you can make bread, and you can make all kinds of different things, desserts and all kinds of stuff. And it just depends what you mix it with and the different kinds of materials that you mix it with, that you get different outcomes. Same thing with clay, exactly the same thing. So the very first grouping of this kind of objects is what we call earthenware. So an earthenware is a type of clay that when it's fired retains its porosity, meaning it's very, water can still seep through it. Normally the color of those clays tend to be tan, brown, or red. And in many cases this is what we call terracotta. So when you hear of terracotta pots or the terracotta soldiers or whatever, is that very low fire clay that's utilized for making those objects. Now, one of the good things for terracotta and pots, if you think about it, is you want to put plants in terracotta potters, because since the earthenware is porous, water can be held inside the little pores inside, for your plant, so it can retain some of the moisture, and it's good for your plants. Anyways, if you notice here, it's called a low fire clay. Well, depending on how high the clay can go, then if it is called a low fire clay. So what I mean by that? What I mean by that is that if you throw anything in the fire, eventually it's going to melt or be destroyed. And depending on how much volcanic ash is available within this clay, then the temperature that you can raise the clay before it actually melts is this temperature right here. So for a low fire clay, an earthenware, you can put it in the kiln, and you can bring the kiln all the way up to about 800 degrees Celsius, all the way up to about 1100 degrees Celsius, and the object will retain its shape. It won't melt. If you go any further than that, right, the molecules will begin breaking down, and then it will melt. It will be one big pile of glass, basically, in your kiln. During the process of firing, what's happening, if you can think in your mind's eye, imagine your fingers being crossed in such a way that they're almost perpendicular. And as the fire goes up, those molecules start to align. So it's as if you take your hands and then slowly try to put them together to where the fingers align or match each other, right? So with low fire clay, though that porosity doesn't align completely, so they don't interlock. So that's why it stays porous. Now, if you notice here, we have this word cone 013 and cone and 06. This is the way in ceramics that we label the temperature changes in the kiln for ceramics. So low fire clay, like an earthenware, can go up as high as up to cone 013 and 06. This is the way we would normally write it out. So here's a chart that gives you the same idea. So here is what I'm talking about. So this is your low fire clay right here, in this area right there, and there's the temperature we're talking about. Okay, and so forth and so on. All right, the next one. Oh, here's an example of a terracotta pot. The next one is stoneware. Stoneware you guys are much more familiar with, because stoneware is what we use for your coffee pot or the all kinds of different dishes in which you can cook with, right? Now, this specific material, this clay, once it's fired, it can go to a slightly higher range, right here to a mid-range of 1200 degrees Celsius up to 1300 degrees Celsius. And because of that, then those particles align much better and it becomes non-porous. So in this case, it's much more safe for food consumption. Right, so previously with your earthenware, you don't want to cook food in there most of the time because, in those little holes you can have bacteria growing. So you really don't want that in some cases. With stoneware, because it is not porous, then you wouldn't have that issue. It's going to be a good clay to cook with. Now, stoneware, because you're able to create so many things that are basically impermeable, in other words, they don't absorb water, then it becomes very, very versatile. This mid-range clay It can go to cone 06 all the way to cone 6, and this is how we write it out. Now, you see how this has a 0 here and it doesn't here? That has to do, whoops, that has to do with our with how much ash, volcanic ash is in the product plus all the materials. So here's what we're talking about. So this mid-range clay is going to be somewhere in here. Also, one thing I haven't pointed out is the color of the clay and the kiln as the temperature rises. And this is really what the clay looks like when it is in the kiln. This is the temperature color that the clay will turn when it's in the kiln. All right, and the last one, here's an example of earthenware, not earthenware, stoneware. Sorry, guys, stoneware, and you can see there's all kinds of different cooking vessels and so forth and so on. While a lot of people say, well, how come can you cook with them? Well, it's pretty simple. In order for you to be able to melt an object like this one, you have to raise your oven all the way up to basically 1300 degrees Celsius, and there's not an oven that you cook on that would ever get to that temperature. So you're very free to cook inside any of these kind of ceramic vessels or cookware. So you can definitely use it. One of the things to avoid is to put any cold water on them while they're still hot, and everybody knows what happens, right? So if you put cold water, they'll crack. The difference in temperatures will tear the particles apart. And the last but not least of these groupings is what we call porcelain. A lot of us think of porcelain as just the actual figurines, and that's not the case. Porcelain is actually a type of clay, and this type of clay has a lot of silica and volcanic ash, actually one of the main components. Well, the beauty about porcelain is that porcelain can go to very, very high temperatures. So those particles that we've been talking about, they align very nicely. And when you align particles that closely together, they become almost translucent. So if you've ever been around, like, your grandma's china, the good stuff, right? Or if you've been around a good china plate, you can actually put it to the light and you can see your hand through it. Not clearly, but you can see through it, and you can see the shadow of your hand. And that's because of this reason, because of that organization of the particles to where it becomes almost translucent. The particles get so tight that it becomes extremely rigid. Porcelain is used for a plethora of reasons and for all kinds of different things as well. So that the teeth, for example, is one of those objects that are made with porcelain. Also, a lot of parts for spaceships as well as for cars that whose temperatures in the engines go to very, very high temperatures. Well, porcelain can actually hold not only the temperature but also the rigidity, the strength necessary to hold those things together. So porcelain is a very, very flexible material, but also a very, very interesting material as well. It's not only good for brittle objects. So here's what we're talking about. This is high range, so you see that. And here's another example. Yes, this is normally what we would think of as china or porcelain. One of the things I haven't mentioned, and that is, why is it called cones? Why do we call it cones? So hopefully you guys can picture this in your mind. The best way to know the exact temperature of the kiln is to have pieces of clay, whatever clay we're using, in that each piece of clay has a different chemical makeup. So as the temperature on the kiln goes up, then you have a range of little cones in the kiln that you can look at, and then one is going to be an 06, maybe an 05, an 04, and so forth and so on. So as the temperature rises, those little cones melt, as I was mentioning earlier. So you have a really good idea of the temperature of the kiln, not so much by a barometer, a thermometer that can measure very high temperatures, but also on those little cones. So it's a lot more effective to look at the cone sometimes than it is to look at the parameter. Why is that? Well, sometimes you have, very high levels of moisture in the air, or you have the opposite, little moisture in the air. All of those things affect how fast or how slow a kiln goes up and down in temperature. So the little cones are a very good way of understanding the temperature of the oven, of the kiln. So that's why we use cones, and that's why they're called cone temperatures here. Hopefully that makes sense. Normally I would be drawing those things on the board and explaining them to you guys. Alright, so when you're working with clay, there's different kinds of finishes that you can do with it. The two main ones is a slip. And a slip is you take the same clay, the same body of the object, and then you put more water on it, and then in that mixture of clay and water, which is what we call a slip, then you add color, you add pigment to it. Once your object is almost completely dry, then you paint over the slip, and then you fire it. Now, one of the things that's going to show you here is that this slip, even though after it's fired, it's going to be porous. And also telling you there's a limited range of colors. Now, the reason for this is because regardless of how much pigment you put in the slip, you always are going to have the undertone of the original clay. So if you're using a terracotta, you're going to have either brown or red, red tonalities to your color. And if you're using a stoneware, you're still going to have either a grayish or a brownish, tannish undertone to all your colors. So there's a limited range of colors. It's not going to be as clear as if you're doing a glaze. And a glaze is slightly different. So a glaze, if you think about it in this manner, I don't know if you've ever broken a drinking cup or coffee mug or something like that. If you look at the edge, you'll see that the whole thing is covered in this really shiny surface. And basically what that is glass. So what it is glaze is silica, which is basically what glass is made out of, right? So you take silica and then you add pigment to it, and then you mix those together, and once the object has been fired once, then you paint this silica with color all around the object. So in many different ways, to simplify it, basically what you're doing is you're covering your object with a layer of glass, and this glass is going to have pigment. So this is the reason why you have so many wonderful colors and so many different colors when you glaze, because the pigment is going to be basically trapped inside those glass particles. So it's going to be non-porous. You're going to have a large range of colors, and you can also do clear, it's just like glass. But also because of the different kinds of chemicals you can add to it, then you can have a gloss finish, you can have a translucent finish, an opaque finish, etc., etc. So hopefully you also you've been thinking that hopefully you can figure out that the glass that we're very familiar with, mirrors and the glass in our cars and our houses, the windows basically, right? That is actually sand, and that's actually a ceramic. So at some point it was liquid, and then later on it turns into a solid through fire. So just keep that in mind. Here's some examples of objects that are made with ceramics, with clay, and then turn into ceramics that are not functional, right? So the difference between, once again, craft and art is the finality of it. Was it made to be functional? So this object right here by Juliette Clovins, obviously it was not meant to be functional. It's a self-portrait. It's not a self-portrait. It's a portrait, and you can see, or you can make your own conclusions here artistically of what she might be trying to accomplish. I don't know much about all the details about her artist statement, exactly what she was trying to accomplish. However, we can definitely see this contemporizing approach to something that we recognize as old-time-ish, just because of the concepts of the blue and the white in China wear, but at the same time with this very contemporary mohawk on what is clearly a female figure. So we can definitely see that there's much more than a simple functionality to this object. It's an artistic object. Here's another one, right? Same kind of concept, or similar kind of concept with Jessica Harrison. She took these objects that we recognize as porcelain and have this kind of, specific concept of time and age and in class and so forth and so on, and she throws in something that makes us questioning all that preconception about the same objects. Is it meant to be functional like the one that you would buy to decorate your house? I don't know. That's something that you probably have to deal with, or to think about. And but at the same time, I do think that in this case, it is much more an artistic approach than it is just a decorative approach. I don't think I know. All right. This one right here is another object and similar approach. So you have this concept, this preconceived concept, not preconceived, but very generalistic concept of porcelain. This object that once again it's attached to history and use and functionality of a specific sort, and then added to this other much more contemporary concept of what Asian aesthetics may look like in the contemporary times. Alright, so that was ceramics. Let's look at glass now. So with glass, you have many different ways that you can work with glass. The first method and the most common one is going to be blown glass. And if you guys ever have gone to Magnolia Street to Seneca Studios, you might have seen this in person or maybe somewhere else. But blown glass is the most common way of creating objects made out of glass. I'm going to post the video as well for this that we normally show in class, so you guys can take a look at an example of blowing glass. The other way you can do it is by casting it. So you can cast it, you can actually take the really hot molten silica, turning into glass, and you can pour it into basically molds, and you can cast glass like you would do any other liquid that turns into a solid. And the other one you can do, it's mold press. And mold pressing is the way that a lot of our drinking glasses and objects are made out of. So you have, this one's an industrial one. So you have molten glass that gets placed. Well, I don't know which way the entrance go in this case. However, you have air that pushes the glass into these molds and it creates a drinking glass in this case, or a wine glass. With glass, you have many different finishes. Ceramics, you have a few, but you have a plenty of colors. With glass, you have all kinds of different ways you can finish it. So you can cut it, and like you would do not a mosaic, but a stained glass window type of thing. You can etch it. That means that you can dip it into acid. A lot of windows and glasses for like bathrooms that look like the smoke look for bathrooms, that's bathroom windows, that's an etched glass. Fusing is a process into where you have an object made of glass and you have molten glass or molten silica, and then you attach one to the other. It's like gluing glass together, but we don't call it gluing, we call it fusing. Lamination is similar. Lamination is when you take very hot glass and then you have all the particles of glass and you attach them to one another, but then you layer those things. You layer one on top of the other. In the video from blowing glass that I'm going to post with this PowerPoint, you will see that they layer some of the color beads with the clear glass to give it a pattern. Leaded, that just means that you can add lead to the color in order to intensify the color. Now we don't do this anymore. This is kind of an old way of doing so, and a lot of old stained glass windows have leaded glass. But contemporarily we no longer add lead to glass. what it does is, just like I mentioned earlier, just intensifies the color. Painted, I mean, you can paint on glass. Unfortunately, when you paint glass, because of the surface being so slick, the paint doesn't have the pores in where you can attach well to the surface, so you'll eventually peel off. Sandblasted. Sandblasted is when you take a high pressure machine that takes air out, but also sand at the same time, and it texturizes the surface. The final look looks a lot like the etched glass. However, if you wet a sandblasted glass, it becomes translucent again. So that's a good way to know whether something's sandblasted or etched. If you wet it, you'll see that sandblasted glass will turn once again translucent, while the etched one won't. It will still be fogging or smoky. Last but not least, in this grouping right here, we have slumped. And slumped is when you have a big piece of glass that's still hot, and then as it cools down, the gravity pulls down on the piece of glass and it curves the glass depending on whatever surface it's on. Alright, so those are the different finishes you can do with glass. There's a couple of examples. Here is one. If you ever go to Vegas, not if, when you go to Vegas and you go to the Bellagio has this installation by Chakuli. So Chakuli is one of the world's most recognized glass artists. He has both bodies of work. He has a body of work that is functional, meaning that he creates cups and vessels and pitchers and all kinds of things like that. But he also has a body of work that's specifically minded on what can be done with glass. So representational artwork, non-representation, all these kind of different things that Dale Chakuli does. So next time you go to Vegas, make sure you go to Bellagio. It's going to be on their main gallery. You see. All right. Here's another artwork made out of glass. This is blown glass as well. This specific artist, she created this series with glass to show the I'm trying to think what the right words are. Not cleaning, how clean a place is, but how sterile locations are that actually require a lot of warmth. So places like hospitals, where people are sick, where babies are born and things like that, the warmth of humanity would be something that people that are sick or who are in the hospitals would need. However, because of their symptoms or whatever else in that case might be, it requires a distancing, and glass in some ways can showcase the fragility of the individual in some ways, but also their sterility and the coldness of this of this kind of objects, like in this case would be a baby's crib in a hospital. So hopefully I'm making sense with this a little bit. It's just weird to have to talk about myself. I know you guys are listening to me, but right now, as you know, I'm recording this and I'm talking to myself, and it's kind of odd. So, all right, so keep up with me. All right, so when it comes to craft, we also have fibers. And fiber just basically means anything that's woven or put together by thread. So we have different methods of fibers. As I just mentioned, weaving is one of the main ones. And when you weave, you normally use a loom. Okay, this is what a loom looks like. When you're working or creating a tapestry or cloth, then you have two different kinds of fibers. The first one is warp fibers. So you can see that the warp fibers. And warp fibers are kind of like the skeleton of your cloth or your of your object, your tapestry. Weft fibers are the fibers that go across and go this way. Now, weft fibers is how you create your pattern, your image. Okay, so that's the difference between a warp fiber and a weft fiber. As I was mentioning, this is how you make tapestries. And tapestries in the world of art is one of the main decorative and functional objects that exist made with fibers. And you guys might have seen this kind of objects on movies or hopefully in a museum. And there's thousands and thousands of tapestries around the world. And tapestries were used to keep places warm. So even though castles were made out of really big stones and masonry, they are very drafty. So in the winter, in order to keep the heat, the warmth within the castles and the palaces, then these objects will be placed on the walls. And at the same time, so it'll have two purposes. One, to keep the warmth, but also to be decorative. One of the beautiful things about tapestries is that tapestries are full of iconography and symbolism. So you can spend hours and hours and hours just looking at every single, individual and object in here, and everything has symbolism of some sort or reference to something. So whenever you go to Europe, if you're interested in tapestries, there is a lot to look at, and every single one of them will have as much information as the next. Contemporarily speaking, if you take this and you contemporize this concept of symbolism and so forth and so on through tapestries, then you have the artist like this one right here, right? So Volati, she used basically the same concept. She has a whole bunch of images, and this is more kind of a self-portrait of sorts, images of herself, and she collaged them into this massive tapestry. Right? Now, if you think about it, something like this, where everything has a meaning or a reason and symbolism, right, is no more different than this. It's just the approach is it's different, obviously, contemporized, but same kind of idea behind it. All right, knitting. I don't know if anybody's knitting, and especially with all the time you guys have now, right? So hopefully you are, but knitting is another way of creating fiber objects. Here's when you take just something as mundane as, knitting, and you explode it into an artistic concept. So in this case, we have an installation, and you do have individuals here. We have several. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 people. I think 4 or 5 in this installation. One of the things to keep in mind when it comes to weaving, and a lot of fibered art, and weaving in many cases has been utilized by female artists to bring concepts of feminism, the power of women in how empowering or disempowering this kind of processes and materials can be to the female, to the women in general. So hopefully I'm being clear on here. But in this case, for example, everything here has at some point or another be touched by a woman. So how can you demonstrate the power of women within the concepts of society and objects? So here it is, right? So literally everything that's been touched by a woman, it's been represented in some ways, covered by weaving. Here's another one as well. Another form of craft, especially here in South, in Texas, we have quilt making. I'm sure a lot of you have quilts at home. Here's a version of a contemporized format of it. Now, you would think, well, how is this contemporized? Well, when we think about modernism and contemporary art, we look at the basics, right? The most simplified version of something. We look at let's say, right, color, texture, those kind of things, and then we work with them. Well, what are the most basic elements of a quilt? Then there is pattern, there is organization, there's all kinds of different things that I'm not very familiar with, but nevertheless are kind of obvious when you look at a group of quilts. Here in this case, you can see that those basic elements have been deconstructed and reconstructed in a different way, in an abstract way.
if you want to call it this way. So it's been abstracted, changed, and altered. Here's another approach. Right, it's the same thing. Take the concepts of what quilt is, and then you rethink how to approach them. So in this case, she dyed her own cloth, cut her own patterns, right, and then reassembled it. And what I like about this one is that she reassembled them in a similar manner as she would paint. So you can see her paintings here, which are fairly abstract expressionistic. So this object here, this quilt, was also approached in a very similar way, right? Very, very abstractual, very expressionistic. Actually, almost non-representational. Actually, probably non-representational, but being a quilt, he could probably abstract you. Okay, basket making, we're going to skip that one altogether. It is part of crafts, but you know, it's just part of weaving too in some ways. Surface design that deals with graphic designing, and if you know anything that deals with patterns in clothing and surfacing, things like that. Paper making is also another craft. If you are in a four-year college at some point and you want to take a class and you had to do like an elective of some sort, and you want to do something that was visual arts, paper making would be it's an interesting class. It's fairly fascinating. The skill level for that, it's something that the classes start from the very beginning. It's normally a pretty good class. So if you want to take an elective some point, and when you get into a four-year college, paper making would be a pretty good one to get into. Wearable art. This one is very important. You need to understand that wearable art is not the same thing as fashion. Okay, they're different things. Now, does fashion look at wearable arts for inspiration? Of course it does. And does wearable art look at fashion for inspiration? Yes, it does. But once again, the big difference between the two of them is functionality. So fashion is looking at how, you know, cloth, color, and all these other objects fall in the human body, and how functional it is with the human body. With wearable art, that's not the case. The body the figure is as much part of the artwork as the object that's being worn. So it's a completely different approaches from both of them. So they are not the same thing. And once again, they do interact in ideas. Some things are crossed from one end to the other, but they are definitely not the same thing. This is Nick Cave. This is probably one of the most recognized artists when it comes to wearables. These are called sound suits, believe it or not. There's a reason why they're called sound suits, and hopefully you guys will get to see the videos. Depending on how the semester goes, and if we're able to see each other face to face by the end of the semester, we'll watch the videos at TCC. If not, I'll be posting the videos for you guys to make comments on regarding several artists. Alright, let's talk about kitsch now. So now we talked about functionality and craft, right, and the difference between craft and art, but also when craft type of approach can move into the art world. Now let's look at the very bottom of the totem pole, which is going to be kitsch. So kitsch is kind of these objects, like I mentioned earlier, these objects that are meant to look functional, but at the very end they're not really. So like this little coin purse, or this little, you know, purse in itself, you put 10, you know, 15 items in it, and the zipper won't close, or it gets stuck in things, so you never really use it as a purse, but it's this little object that's hanging on your door in your bedroom, or like I mentioned earlier with the salt and pepper shakers, they're just in your kitchen being decorative rather than being a salt and pepper shaker. The most recognized artists in the world for taking kitsch and then moving it from this kind of lackluster functionality, if you call it that way, and just pure decorative purposes, is going to be Jeff Koons. Oops, I forgot about this girl. Okay, so before I talk about Jeff Koons, let's talk about another artist who's taking this material and gone wild with it. So you take, sorry guys, I have to kind of remember Lisa Liu. So Lisa Liu, this artist took the material, right, another material that is very much attached or referential to the female gender, and exploded it into full versions of human scale kitchens and other areas where quote unquote women are supposed to inhabit or work in. So here's one example of her installations. And every single thing in this surface is made with the same kind of materials as the little purse, right? The little beads. So here's a close-up of some of the objects. And here's another one of her installations, this barbecue location. So pretty interesting, especially the close-ups, right? So here you go. And she doesn't do it all herself. She you know, goes to locations and many people at a time. You know, everybody does one little thing. So you'll have one day where a whole bunch of people do blades of grass, and then the next day they do the flowers and so forth and so on. And within a matter of months, you have a full installation. So, but she does a lot of the work herself, of course. Out of all the works that I think I show in class, the next work by her, by Lou, it's one of my favorites. Because it really embodies what she's trying to say artistically with the material, as well as the visuals, the graphics that she's applying this into. So in this specific sculpture here, you can see what she's trying to say with the material, but also visually with the imagery. Oops, right here. So the damned, and is just absolutely beautiful, and all the little, both of the figures are completely covered in those little beads made out of, you know, golden beads. So really, really beautiful. All right, so let's talk about Jeff Koons now. So this is the one that I was mentioning when we first started talking about kitsch. So Jeff Koons, so here's the salt and pepper shakers that I was talking about. So he's the one that talks about the pop quality of kitsch. And by pop quality, I mean pop not as popular, but as in things that you want to have or want to consume. So he understands, or his artistic concepts come from understanding our need for wanting things, and he really finds the beauty within that need for us in the, you know, in this contemporary world of wanting to want things. So here's one of those objects that is an exaggeration of one of those salt and pepper shakers. Right? Those little objects that we want to have on top of our kitchen counter that is completely useless. So he had this object of Michael Jackson and Bubbles created in the same kind of material and way in which those kind of objects, the kitsch objects, are made out of. Now, one of the things to understand about Jeff Koons is that Jeff Koons never touches his artwork. He creates the ideas, and then he finds the right people who create the objects, and then have the objects made for him. Some people in the art world like that, some people don't. At the end, in my case, I really don't care, because at the end, art is mainly in the idea. And many artworks by many different artists, including the artists from the Renaissance and throughout time, the main artist very rarely touches the artwork. It's only the details and the final outcome in which they are part of. So that's my 2 cents on that. Right, so here's a couple of his artworks as well. Right, so this is all about people and want. He talks about the wants of the pop. So think about the objects that, you know, people want all the time. Well, the ultimate, you know, what's this, vacuum cleaner? How many of you have a Dyson at home, right? The perfect vacuum. And you look at commercials, and they're normally talking about all this perfect housewares and things that people want to have, and not only this, but cars and other objects. So what he does is he takes this preciousness of these objects and then brings them into the museum. So yes, you're looking at a vacuum cleaner, but at the end, what does a vacuum cleaner represent? It's this idea of want and the preciousness of the object. Another way we can put it is, an iPhone or a contemporary phone, right? If you think about it, right, when you go to an Apple store, how are they displayed? Almost in this kind of same concept, and it is about our need or drive for wanting things all the time. Here's another one. And this one is in Bilbao, in Spain. And this one you might have seen around the world. If you go around different cities around the United States and around the world in general, you'll see these really large balloon animals here and there. And the best thing to describe this kind of objects is if you were a child, right, and if you went to a party or if you went to a fair and there was a clown making balloon animals and giving them out for free, how many children would want one? I would probably dare to say that every single child would want one, and not only the children, but also probably the adults in so many different ways, right? Inside, we all kind of want this little precious object that is, you know, a balloon. It's kitsch, right? It's going to be decorative. There's no purpose for it. So think about it in that manner, right? This is the one thing, the balloon animal, something that anybody could not say to, and he's created his sculptural objects that are basically balloon animals to talk about or discuss artistically this idea of want. Now he also has a series, an early series of his work that deals with pornography. I don't want to encourage it, but it would be really interesting for you guys to look at some point as adults and kind of apply the same kind of mentality to it. This approach of want and consumption to something as raw as pornography can be. So if you ever want to kind of look into it, look at I forgot the name of the series. Something in Heaven. Let me see if I have it here on the PowerPoint. No, I don't. But anyway, if you look at Jeff Koons, and then I don't think it's Paradise in Heaven, it's something Heaven. So look it up, Google it up. I wish I could pull up Google right now on the screen, kind of, just to make sure I had the right name. But I can't because if I change the application, it stops the recording, so I can't. But anyways, try to look for it, see, and apply those concepts I just mentioned. So hopefully with this PowerPoint, you'll see what the difference is between craft and art and kitsch. But one of the things to also come out of this is that you understand that even though crafts are made mainly with a functional purpose, they can also be brought into the artistic world depending on the idea. Same thing with kitsch. Alright guys, so this is the PowerPoint on craft, and make sure you take your quiz. It's 10 questions long, and hopefully you'll be waiting for the next PowerPoint.